return to their country of origin. The French have tried this. The Germans have tried this. These things don't work very well because they don't control this process very well. And an Algerian that has accepted $500 or $5,000 to go back to Algeria slips in and asks for another $5,000.
You can't pay people to leave. We learned that with the Vikings.
The Vikings were in a position to take the money and come back anyway.
Well,
I think you're probably mistaken about certainly the preferences of white people. Yes, they're concerned about house prices. They could get a far nicer house for far less money if they were willing to accept this house along with black or Mexican neighbors. They would also find that their commute into the downtown is much shorter if they were prepared to accept black or Mexican neighbors. They would find that there are neighborhood schools within walking distance if they were prepared to send their children to classes in which whites are a minority. All of these things are, of course, part of the consideration, but whites, by and large, at least in the United States, are prepared to sacrifice those advantages because when they are farther out and they have longer commutes and they have more expensive housing, perhaps a 25-minute bus ride to their school, they can be among people with whom they're comfortable. So I think whites, by and large, if there were acceptance of the idea of separation, which you may derisively consider tribal, but tribal sentiment, I think, is a powerful and legitimate thing. If this were accepted, and if more and more whites were expressing that preference, I think you'd be surprised at how small the number would be who wished to remain in the multiculti areas rather than going with their tribe. When there are prison riots in the United States, it's not the Methodists trying to kill the Baptists.
No.
It's not the people from Minnesota trying to kill the people from Wisconsin.
Yeah.
It is blacks, Hispanics, and white people trying to kill each other. It's the same if there's a riot in a school. They don't riot. It's not the 11th graders trying to gang up on the 9th graders or the football team trying to beat up the hockey team. These expressions of hostility invariably fall along racial lines. And so I agree that human beings are tribal in a variety of ways. And Europeans, despite being the same race, have slaughtered each other with incredible diligence over what, in retrospect, seem utterly minor differences. But when push comes to shove, because race is a biological fact, because race cannot be concealed, because, in effect, we wear our uniform on our face 24 hours a day, this is, to me, obviously, where you find multiracialism, you find these ruptures, it is one that is very, very difficult to overcome. You will find the same black identity everywhere in Africa. I remember traveling. I remember traveling in the Ivory Coast in the late 1970s and admiring how successful it was. And that was a time when there was a great deal of French government participation in running the country. And Ivory Coast was called the Japan of West Africa. Well, it was only maybe 5 or 6 years ago there were these anti-white riots in Ivory Coast, which had been so successful. It was an expression again of the African desire to live free from any kind of white tutelage. This was not very widely reported in the West, but there was a great deal of anti-white violence, and many whites left. And Ivory Coast, I don't think, is ever going to recover in quite the same way. And it's not just in Zimbabwe. It's not just in South Africa, of course, where I think eventually we're going to have white people just streaming out of South Africa with the clothes on their backs. I don't think that multiracialism is going to work in the long term there. And the same was true in Congo. When Congo was independent, massacres of whites. Same thing in Mozambique, same thing in Angola. The Portuguese were sent packing. And now there's kind of an uneasy coexistence between this expatriate community and a kind of resentful, larger African presence. I don't think multiracialism works very well anywhere in Black Africa. I don't think multiracialism works well anywhere. And if you look at Sudan, they finally split the country into two because the blacks in the south felt very much disadvantaged and persecuted by the Arab north. No, these things just don't work out. When you had black riots in the United States in the 1960s, you did not have this overwhelming media message. You deserve to have a chip on your shoulder. You have been kicked around. It is understandable if you riot. They rioted because they hated the society that they lived in.
But in the 60s, that's probably understandable, isn't it?
Well, the fact is, because of racial differences in ability, blacks in large numbers will never be achieving at the same level as whites. But let me get back to a point you made earlier, sure. And that was your acceptance of the idea that if whites wish to establish their own communities, they should have the right to do so. Now, does that not also accept the idea of white regions, white states, even white nations? If these can be achieved peacefully, would you consider them to be legitimate goals? That I know many people who are moving to Hungary because it is explicitly a country that wishes to preserve its European heritage. This is something very attractive, even though Hungarian is one of the most difficult languages to learn on earth.
It's not European, that's why.
Yeah, exactly. It seems to have dropped from the sky. We don't know where it came from. But
somewhere in Central Asia, I imagine.
Yes. No, whites, I think, given the opportunity, will, once they have been given permission morally to express their inherent preferences, will gravitate in ever-increasing numbers to an area that reflects their genetic heritage. This is perfectly natural and normal. And once these opportunities present themselves, and once society at large stops saying these desires are somehow evil, these desires are hateful, once people are liberated from this nonsense about wanting to preserve their own heritage and people and culture, I think expressions of this kind will blossom and bloom, not just in the United States, but all around the white world. This is a natural expression of preference. Let me put it to you this way. You have children.
Yes.
I'm sure that you love your children more than any other children on earth.
Of course.
Now, is this because they are objectively superior to all other children? Of course not. They're not.
No, that's not true. My son is objectively more adorable.
By you.
I know.
Perhaps not by anyone else. You love them because they are yours.
Yes.
And you make no apologies for this. This is a kind of irrational tribalism that is expressed around the world. I think that most unbrainwashed people's natural inclinations is to have the same instinctive attachment to their extended family, which is this group of people that looks like them. This is likewise not an expression of distaste for others. I'm sure you get along fine with the children of others. You can be quite fond of the children of others, but yours come first. This to me is an almost perfect parallel of the natural, instinctive, and healthy preference for one's people in a biological sense. And when this is expressed, it need not reflect any kind of hostility, as I say. We can draw boundaries, and we can say, you can stay on that side, and we will have mutually satisfactory relations. We can visit each other, we can trade, but please let us pursue our own destiny unhampered by the embrace of people unlike ourselves. That, to me, is a splendid vision of humanity for all of us. If I wish to employ people, or if I wish to serve people, if I wish to live with people, we have very, very strict laws. No, well, it does affect me personally. If I want to have a restaurant and I wish to serve only white people, I don't have that right. The government will say, no, you must admit these people. If I want to have a nightclub and I wish to attract young men and young white women so that they will meet each other and have young white children, oh my gosh, can you imagine just the sort of opprobrium that would attract?
And you run out of fuel, and everyone says, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to serve you because you're black. And then if you want to get a drink, no, I'm sorry, you can't have a drink because you're black. We don't serve blacks here. How is that acceptable?
Well, you are not harming anyone by refusing to deal with that person. He is no worse off than he was before. No, you're not harming him.
If he's a thirsty man and he needs a drink, you are harming him by refusing to serve him.
No, you have not made him any thirstier. You have left him in exactly the state he was. He may be disappointed, but he's not harmed. Now, it's like the question I raised earlier about my wishing to spend time in the company of some movie starlet. She has not harmed me. She has disappointed me if she says, get lost, geezer. Now, the whole question of The free market, if need be, will take care of those questions if there is a large demand for them. And in fact, nobody's going to starve to death because he wasn't able to.
Oh no, I concede it's.
I think that if there were separate communities, if there were separate black communities that were governed by blacks, you would not have this constant friction of white police being asked to do what I think is the most difficult job in the world, or certainly the most difficult job in the United States, and that is to try to stop and prevent crime in black communities. All of this would go away if there was a kind of understanding that institutional superstructure should be one in which people are governed by people like themselves. I think that the resentment against whites would be far less if blacks, as a routine matter, were governed by people who were of the same race. And the same with whites. As far as a balkanized America, yes, you would find people, you continue to find people who say that everything that has ever gone wrong for non-white people anywhere around the world in any time of history is the fault of white people. This is a sickness that many white people have. White people love to feel good about themselves by feeling bad about being white. And this is something unique to whites. And I don't know how that sickness can be cured. But if it were clear that blacks were really working at their own level, that they were masters in their own house, this kind of objection would be much, much harder to make. And I believe that that would lead to at least a reconciliation with the fact of, eventually, of racial differences. Now, I understand that you agree that blacks and whites on average do not have the same IQ, and that there's a genetic contribution to this. You concede that point, do you not? And as you know, in the United States, every time there is any kind of achievement, whether it's running a Fortune 500 company or being admitted to Harvard or getting Academy Awards or whatever it is, everyone is counting the black faces and the Asian faces and the Hispanic faces.
Yeah.
This is nonsense. Oddly enough, this bean counting, this face counting goes by the boards if it is a professional football team, professional basketball team. Everyone quietly accepts, well, gosh, I guess they're just better at that than white people, or certainly better than Asians or Mexicans. How many Mexican linebackers are there? Yeah, none. But in every other field of endeavor, we are always wringing our hands and agonizing over the fact that blacks are not represented in sufficient numbers. Hispanics are not represented in sufficient numbers. All of this is a terrible, terrible drag, not only on a smooth functioning of society, but it's all part of this instilling of guilt that you described earlier, according to which whites are blamed when non-whites do not achieve at the same level. This is psychological poison that I believe drives an enormous amount of what you decry as this social justice warrior depredations on the American psyche. Well, people talk about being red-pilled, that I would call this white people gaining some sort of form of racial consciousness. I think reality is the most powerful red pill. More and more white people are waking up to the crisis that they as a group face, certainly in the United States and really all around the white world. Immigration is reducing us to a minority, and the current dogma is that whites are to blame if non-whites do not perform at the same level of whites. This is ultimately a scenario that will lead to our extinction 200 years from now. If it is condemned to if the idea that whites have the right to remain a majority, and if whites should prefer or are allowed to prefer to continue their own race by marrying people of the same race, if all of these ideas are condemned, eventually we will disappear. Ultimately, it's a question of survival. And certainly in the United States and around the world, more and more white people recognize that not only is our culture something that depends on us biologically, but our biological continuity, something even more fundamental, is threatened by all of the forces that have been put in motion by modernity. And that if we are to survive as a people with a distinct culture, we have the obligation, we have the duty to stop these forces while we have the time to do so.